All right. I am here with Jeffrey Gabriel, and he is the founder of saw.com. Amazing domain name.
Mhm.
How's it going, Jeff?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
Doing good. Doing good. So before we get to the kind of business that is saw.com, let's talk about your background. How did you get started?
Well, the long and the short version was I graduated college back in 2002. I actually come from a family of lawyers, and I actually got into law school, but in the summertime before I went to law school, I started selling loans. My dad was a real estate lawyer, and he's like, "Why don't you start selling some mortgages?" I went to an ad in the newspaper, and he said, while you're in law school, you could sell loans and make an okay living, and then when you get out of law school, we can work together at my practice and carry on the family business. Those are some great plans that my dad had for me. But once I started selling loans, I realized that sales was something that I was a lot better at than going to study for, the bar or becoming a lawyer and doing real estate law, because that wasn't as exciting to me. And so I did that for a number of years, but I realized and kind of thought to myself, either I'm going to start my own mortgage brokerage or try something else. I did a loan for an entrepreneur and started working and selling into HR staffing companies. It was kind of like selling access to like a monster.com. And then 2009 hit, where it was like the financial meltdown. And I don't know if you remember that, when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the banking system collapsed. And I was actually chuckling with my friend, remember cash for clunkers? I mean, how ridiculous is that? Just bringing in all these cars. Do you think that would happen in the environment, the way people are about the environment today? Just going to bring in all these working cars and take them off the road and destroy them? To prop up Ford and GM. Anyways, so I lost my job, obviously, working for an HR type of firm. And I started applying to companies that I always thought were interesting and had an interesting business model. And one of them was a company called Sedo, SEDO.com, which is a domain marketplace. And at the time, nobody was hiring. And they pretty much offered me a waitress's salary with commission, which was actually less than unemployment. And I started selling there, and they gave me a shot, and I busted my ass for a number of years there, just pumping the phone, learning the business as best I could. Within about a year and a half, I ended up selling sex.com and broke the Guinness World Record for the biggest domain sale ever for $13 million.
The URL that you sold, sex.com, is pretty impressive. 13 million at the time. Was that you and a team? Was that you individually that did that sale? I just wanted to highlight that because that's quite the watermark of a domain sale.
Yeah. So I'll give you some background to it. There was a client of the company I work for, Cedo. He was a lawyer. He was involved in a bankruptcy. That bankruptcy was the company called Escom that owned sex.com. And they had to sell the domain in order to pay off the debtors. And so in speaking with him, we were able to put together a proposal which awarded Cedo, the company I work for, the right to sell sex.com. Now, it wasn't just because Jeff Gabriel worked there. A big part of that was the history and the industry knowledge of Cedo being one of the top domain brokerages in the world at the time. But once that was awarded, I worked on that day and night for months.
Cool.
And I have to say, it was unique to a lot of other sales that I've had the opportunity to be part of, because for two reasons. The first was the price was higher than any domain name ever, and a lot of people laughed at me and thought it was kind of a joke. The second part is, and for the record, I'm not involved in the adult business. Okay, I don't have all this knowledge. I know a little bit about it that I've learned from it, but I'm not like on the sets and all that craziness that some people think just because I sold sex.com. But what I did learn is calling into these massive companies, they don't put their real names on LinkedIn, and they don't put their real names out there, and they all say they work for advertising agencies. So it's very hard to navigate as a salesperson when you're looking for contacts at these companies to call into the head of marketing, the CMO or the CEO, and they're very guarded and kind of set back more so than really any other companies that I've attempted to infiltrate to get to respond to me. So it was a really challenging experience, and it was something I'll never forget.
Wow. That's a crazy one. So you have your time at Cito and you kind of learn about this whole like premium domain. 3-letter domains are, renowned for being extremely expensive and valuable. And I think that it's cool to kind of, you get to see how it's made, and then you spin out, you start your own kind of shop out in the Cayman Islands, which is, like you said, an adventure. That's like quite the move to the Caymans. Very cool. So let's talk a little bit about the types of domains that you were working on. Like this is, because to me, this is almost like online real estate. Similar to online businesses, you're just selling like the kind of rebranding assets to kind of fix and flip in a way. Like if somebody buys a business, like we were talking about before we were recording, they could buy a premium URL, premium domain, rebrand what the business they had purchased, and then it immediately becomes like a more successful brand and more successful business by doing that. So I'd love to kind of understand like where you see the worth in investing in these types of things. Like, is it in your experience with buying and selling? Where's the value, and where can people kind of think through, long-term business strategies with this?
Okay. So when I went down the Cayman Islands, I didn't found that company. I worked for somebody who owned a big portfolio of names. We built
Yep.
the business up together, just for the record there. But when I worked there, they weren't all blockbuster sales like sex.com. The majority of the sales you do, a lot of the times, are like a 2-word.com, say atlantatowing.com, or a made-up brandable style domain name, right? And so when you're talking about investing, I'm going to take it from the perspective of a business owner, not of a domain investor, about investing in a domain. All right. So the first question I would say to somebody who's asking me, should I invest in a better domain, or should I invest in a really good domain for my project? The first thing is the domain is extremely important, but you never want to put yourself in a financial situation where you're entirely betting on this domain to do magic. It's not going to do magic, but it's going to help you as a business, right? And so the investment you need to think about what kind of business you are. So if you're a B2B, does your audience understand domains? Are they technically advanced? Are you just a common service provider to local businesses in your local area? You need to think about that as well. So what do I mean by that? Well, a company that's B2C, or local businesses, or just to the general public really understands, in the United States at least, com, net, org. You ask somebody on the street about org, oh, those are all nonprofits. That's not true, but that is a common idea or denominator. If you start getting into these cutesy kind of extensions that your general kind of audience don't understand, then that's going to hurt you because it causes confusion and issues, right? You can, as an entrepreneur, if you're targeting a very savvy group of individuals, investing in a .io, a .ai for your business, or an XYZ, your target audience understands those extensions. The common person doesn't, right? So I would be sticking with com or net in most cases if I was a local, smaller business. And the common person trusts those extensions, right? So that's really important. The other thing is not forcing it. So what do I mean by that? We have people and customers that have purchased domains, and when they want to buy the domain like Jackpots with an S, since Jackpots with an S is really expensive, they put a Z on the end instead of the S. Now, that's not common vernacular in the United States. That's not normal. It's actually kind of somebody that might not be very well educated. So I wouldn't really feel that confident if that was a gambling site for me to put in any kind of material amounts of money into the business. If I tell my friends about it and it's a really great business and opportunity, or a really cool concept, I have to tell them it's not the Z, it's not the S, it's the Z. And you have to explain it. Or if you're at a trade show, you have to explain your domain. That's not good, right? Because people forget and they go to the wrong place, or they send emails to the wrong place. That becomes a security issue. So it's a lot easier to potentially get something that you can easily tell people and invest in. They can easily remember, they can easily tell their friends, and they're comfortable going to, right? And so when someone tells me what kind of domain should I invest in for my business, it doesn't have to be a oneword.com. Those start at very expensive amounts of money. You don't need that, right? Just like you don't need to buy a 2-carat diamond for your 22-year-old girlfriend, right? You can start with a fake one, right? If you don't make a lot of money, you don't need to go into huge debt at this point in your life. Buy it to her, buy it for her on your 10-year anniversary. If she loves you, she'll still be around, right? So the idea would be, if I was starting a business, I was on a short budget, a short leash of money, I would look at .nets. Why? .nets aren't very popular right now. They're kind of like, I guess, they're like the white New Balances that everybody makes fun of that the boomers wear, right? And they're not super popular in trends. So they're not under huge demand. And you could get a really good one-word .net under $10,000 right now. But a really good one-word.com is starting at $100,000. And the general public trusts .net. That's a good investment. And if your business explodes and really takes off, then guess what? Then you jump up to the big leagues and maybe you pay for it and you buy it. But it's not a smart idea to just jump into these things. And I also think if you force it and it's like, you're the jackpots with a Z.net, that's even worse. .com, that's even worse. Why not just spend $3,000 on the .net and maybe you could get there's some other cool way of saying jackpot that's all one word and people again are used to doing it, right? And I would say thinking about it in a more common sense way can work out for you.
There's a pretty relevant story to this recently. I don't know if you read about friend.com, but it was a young Gen Z entrepreneur in New York, and he raised $2.5 million to do this AI app and raised 2.5, spent $2 million on friend.com.
Yeah.
And people went wild on social media saying, this is ridiculous. Why would you do something like this? And the amount of press that he got from people basically saying this is a terrible idea. How could he do this? Was easily worth, 7 figures worth of viral press. It was everywhere. Everybody was talking about it and that it was just this crazy phenomenon. And, he got a ton of signups, a ton of pre-orders and everything from it. So there's definitely immense value, especially depending on the business you're in. And you really touched on it with local businesses, meaning people need to trust it. The common consumer needs to trust what they're about to click on, especially if they're entering in, sensitive information. I remember back in the day, I know you probably remember this as well, Jeff, when entering in your credit card online was bad. It was just, you wouldn't do it. It was,
just
now it's one button that your credit card's already on there forever and it's just linked and you just press a button all the time. But I remember when that was a taboo thing, was putting your credit card on there. But I guess when it comes to valuation, I'd love to jump onto that real quick because you mentioned .com starting at $100K, .net around $10K-ish, which I love that we have these sort of price points to talk about. How do you value a domain? To start with, how does that start?
So before we get into that real quick, I just want to say one thing about friend.com, right? Or friends.com, is that you don't know when he posted that he paid that much money for it. You don't know. There's two variables there that I was thinking about, and I remember exactly that story. The first variable is on a domain of that amount of money, a lot of the times the buyer can negotiate terms and pay that off over 5 years or 3 years. Right. So maybe the final price is 2, but maybe he only put up $200,000.
Yeah.
Right. And then he's getting to use that as pay for it monthly, $20,000 a month or $10,000 a month. Or he paid the 2, but that was his only Series A, right? And he knows another round of funding for 10 is coming in 8 months. Maybe that was part of the strategy and you just don't know. So I don't know if he was being that wild and reckless, but you're right. He did get a ton of value out of it and it was really smart. But talking about valuations, okay, so there's different ways to look at it. And the easiest way to value any domain name is, it doesn't matter what the extension is, always think it's .com first, and then make a proportion to the other extension. So I'll show you, right? So any one-word.com, I immediately think the length. Now, it's not necessarily the length is the number of characters, okay? It's the length of how long that particular keyword can be. So insurance, that's probably one of the most competitive keywords on the internet today, right? In the United States, the term insurance, what other insurance is there? There isn't. That's as short as it's going to be. The second choice might be cheap, free, whatever. Put keywords in front of it, okay? Or then it turns into brands. So insurance.com is as short it's going to be, but it's a whole bunch of letters. So the length is important. Extension is important. Then it comes into what industry does it fall into? How competitive is that industry? And if you know about Google AdWords in general, you're going to see that things having to do with insurance, the cost per click on keywords is wild. It's like $50, $60, $100 a click in those kinds of ads. Now, if you compare that to writers, AI has wiped out writers, right? It's just not great right now, or something else. If that industry isn't extremely competitive, then that tells you there's not a huge amount of demand for the domain name. So I immediately look at the industry. Then I look and see how universal it is in multiple languages, right? Like, so a domain like yoga. Yoga is yoga in English, in German, in Spanish, in Swahili. It's yoga. And there's no plural. Yogas? No. I mean, yogis? I don't know. But yoga is a very great brand. It's short, it's sweet, it's easy to spell, it exudes positivity, and it's right directly to the point as to the good or service you're offering. Almost an unfair competitive advantage you're getting. So when I look at those, and you look at obviously past sales that are supporting to that, that helps create the idea of what the value should be. The other thing I like to do is, and yoga is really like a layup. Same with insurance. Kind of crazy with the name. I always like to search immediately the keyword of the domain. So the name like Flippa. I search Flippa. So obviously it's a developed site that sells websites, but if it wasn't to that, I would want to see how many other companies or individuals find that keyword to be important to their business. A domain that our company is currently selling is called Infinia.com. If you search Infinia, there's probably 40 or 50 companies that use that name, spanning all kinds of different industries all over the world. And there's all kinds of different variations and extensions using it, right? So that tells me that somebody wants that name and one of them is going to pay a lot of money for it. If you search it and it's a barren wasteland and it's either like maybe a Wikipedia page or a dictionary explanation as to what it is, and there's nothing, the commercial demand, well, that tells me the world doesn't see that much value in it, right? And so unless that's like a really trendy up and coming word or a cool brand name for your business that you want, that domain isn't going to be worth a whole heck of a lot of money. And that's kind of how I look at it. And then when it comes to these like GTLD extensions or other types of extensions, you try to make a proportion. We just did with .NET. I think a .NET is usually worth 15, I used to say 20%, but I'd say it's more like 15% of a .com database, right? Especially with other competition like .co, IO, AI, XYZ. And they're not as favorable as they were.
Mhm.
So, those are the things I really look at. And I also try to really just see, again, is the competition for that name, how many suitors really want it and what you can do with it. And then again, it's all about the industry that it can target, right? I mean, I've used this as an example before, the domain trafficking.com. Trafficking has huge search. If you search it, it has all kinds of news about it, but it's polarizing and negative news, and it's not good, right? When you think of the word trafficking, you think of Jeffrey Epstein, you think of drugs, you think of bad stuff. So that's an exception to the rule because it shows huge volume, huge action, but you don't want to be associated with it. It's just not a good thing, right? So there's different ways of looking at it.
Well, okay, I got it. Very industry specific, and I like the diligence process. I want to talk a little bit about the deal structures. So I have some experience with this, and one of my favorite examples of this was like a holdback where businesses that are going through an acquisition, through an exit, a domain is a fantastic mechanism to keep the ownership of. You're transferring assets all over if it's an asset purchase, and the domain really is one of what I've seen, one of the more popular assets to keep the rights of as, assets get transferred over. And then during an earnout, you can even hold on to it throughout the earnout and kind of have it as this magic key to eventually be over the line with an exit. So I've seen a lot of creative structures. You mentioned with the friend.com example, which I'm glad that we get to talk about that. That there's a lot of creative ways of approaching buying something as incredibly valuable, like a 3-letter, like saw.com or one of these domains. What are some of the creative structures that you've done, that you've seen done, that you could share?
I'll start with a very basic one. We have a lot of clients that come to us and they say, we're working on getting funding, or we're working on trying to prove that the product is something that people would like. So we're trying to build an MVP for this and then testing it in different places and in different ways. And during that time, they're asking me, what do you think about this domain? Can you find out what the owner would like for it or if it's even available for sale? Right. And then they're saying that we're probably like, say right now, I spoke to somebody and they're saying we're thinking about maybe buying it in like February or March, right? Or April. And you're like, okay. So when you talk to the sellers, like they're obviously not committed to you to sell the domain name at any price for any period of time. I mean, you're knocking on someone's door and saying, hey, would you sell it? And then, things can change and their attitude can change. So my client asked me to find this particular domain. I looked into it and they said, we just want a ballpark as to what the price is so we can put it in our book for when we're trying to raise money. And I said, fine. So I said, hey, the seller wants $45,000 for this domain name. And they said, yeah, that's okay. Obviously we should negotiate it down. And I said, it would be a smart idea of you guys. Do you have $5,000? And they were like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So what if we did an option to buy and you pay them $5,000 now, and then 6 months from now you owe the remainder? And we'll try to negotiate that part. But during that time, you can't use the domain at all. It's just going to sit in holding and they can't sell it to anybody. And that actually works, right? I mean, a decent amount of money. Right. You can't be like, here's $100 and be kind of obnoxious about it. But like that $5,000 and the seller didn't want to do it. But that $5,000 did two things, right? The first was it gave my client their answer and they didn't have to keep looking for a domain name and they were able to put it on their pitch book when they went to go pitch their idea of their service and plans and however they're going to prove that this idea was a good one, right? And it gives it an identity, which was good. The other thing is that I sold the seller who didn't want to do this because he's like, well, what if I got a buyer in the meantime? I said to him, you probably won't because it's a pretty obscure domain and it's a brand style domain, number one. But number two, they're going to stop shopping for other domains. And because if you go and you say no to this, they're going to keep looking in the meantime and they might find something that's cheaper and something they like more. And they're going to have me go get that instead. So you're going to end up with nothing, right? So he's like, oh yeah, good point. And then he's like, fine. And the point was they can't use it. Now, the biggest fear of a domain owner is if there's an unknown party that's going to give them a few $1,000s and their asset they believe is worth $50,000 and that this buyer is going to come in and shit all over it and get it banned and on Google and spam with it, commit crimes. Technically, that seller is still the owner. It's just being held by an escrow company while this is happening, and they could do some, irreparable damages to the domain for very short money. So anyways, we worked that out. That was a very basic one. I've also done ones where established companies have traded stock for domain names. I've also done one where an insurance company, even though the domain didn't resolve, had a very sizable platform behind the scenes that was using the domain, and the buyer paid the money in full to the escrow company. And then the seller was allowed to take up to 6 months to migrate this platform off of that domain name. And then at the end of those 6 months, they had to transfer, the name, and they did that. So these kinds and styles of sales happen a lot. And I think the best advice that I can give any of your listeners or yourself is if you're going to go and do these kinds of transactions that are relatively complicated, is you have to be empathetic to the person on the other side. And so what that means is I have a lot of people that come to me with really big plans for someone else's domain name, but they're unwilling to give any reasonable amount of money to do something like this up front, that the seller have a reason to take it off the market and take a risk, and or, buyers that are unwilling or disorganized in a point where they say, oh, well, I'll give you stock. But like the stock is, the business isn't really something that there's ever even going to be an exit. And it's just not really a good thing. And then they kind of have an attitude towards the seller about it. And then it just kind of doesn't work. So you have to understand. And then sellers also have to understand that there's a reason why a buyer is offering you this, because the deal is shaky. And there is a good chance that the buyer isn't going to get this money, and that there's a reason why, and that you can't expect them to pay you, half of your list price up front and the remaining half in 6 months when they're not even sure they're going to get anything in funding, right? So, you have to understand both sides of the coin, and it's challenging.
Yeah. For sure. And I look at that first deal that you mentioned, very similar to like earnest money in real estate. It's a very clever way of locking it down, putting it under contract kind of thing, which is really smart. I like that. And the creative deal structures is what everybody listening to this, I'm sure, is into. And it's what makes this fun. for sure.
Yeah, and what you mentioned at a company called escrow.com, where if you're transferring a website and a business, they call it a milestone transaction. And so you can look into that. And what you do is you create milestones in a schedule that this amount of money is given, then it'll be dispersed once this is done, and it just goes in steps until it's all done. And kind of like a construction loan, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And it works. It's tedious, and it's a pain in the ass writing up the contract and agreeing on the steps. And obviously, you pull up the carpet is something that people didn't realize or recognize or think about in the middle of those steps. And sometimes they change. And again, it's kind of going into it knowing that, it's a dance that you need to be empathetic about on either side.
Yeah. And I'd love to shift gears into trends that you've seen and how social media plays into this. Because I know early on in like the Twitter/X days, people were buying, usernames that were a couple, like just people's names and couple words or one letter URLs. So what type of trends have you seen over the years, like especially the past 5 years specifically in the domain space?
So when I got in the domain business in 2009, just to give you some basic background, a lot of online education names were extremely valuable. That was like what was really hot, right? And then it kind of just went into like nutraceuticals. I don't remember like the Aki Berry stuff. Then it was like steroid stuff. Then it was ringtones were big for a period of time, ringtone related names. Then the Chinese market went wild because, and this is pre-crypto, right? So Chinese market went wild for 2-letter, 2-digit, 3-digit, 3-letter, 4-letter, 4-digit, 5-letter, and 5-digit domains because a Chinese citizen is limited to the amount of money that they can have leave the country in a yearly basis, unless it's real estate or technology. And all of a sudden, for some reason, domains got included in as technology. And so what Chinese people were doing is they were buying domains and using them as vehicles. They called them chips, and trading them outside of China.
Wow.
So they would get their money out and into the United States or into wherever else, but not China, right? And so that was a really common thing. And that market went absolutely wild. And it was like stocks every day. And depending on the numbers, like 8 is really good. To us, 666 is the devil. That's like really good luck. 666, 4 is death. And that's because when they pronounce the numbers, it's phonetic, right? So however you say 4 sounds like death in Mandarin. So they don't like that. So they use numbers and letters and mixtures to create value, right? And so that was really big. Then that kind of collapsed because crypto came into place. And then crypto was a lot easier of a vehicle for the Chinese to get money out of China, and it didn't limit them as much. And then all the coin and exchange related names went through the roof. Then we got into during COVID, there was fintech related names were really popular in different bits of technology. Blockchain was big for a while. And then blockchain and crypto names kind of took a dive when FTX bombed. So there's kind of like a lull there. And then AI started to really pump, and it's been really pumping since. So a lot of AI or .ai related domain names have really exploded in value in the last, I'd say 12 and 24 months.
Nice.
And that's where we are in a nutshell.
Very nice. So knowing what you know now, what would you tell Jeff 10 years ago?
Oh, what would I tell myself 10 years ago? I'd say, go start your own business and buy as much crypto as you possibly get your hands on and .ai domain names. Yeah. That's what I would say.
Well,
but,
cool.
there's not much. Looking back at things, you can't look that way. You look forward. I have a lot of things that you kind of regret you didn't make the right decisions on or opportunities you missed, but I'm sure with you too, you made a lot of the right decisions that worked out. So that's the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And it's common on here for people to say, I wish I bought Bitcoin 10 years ago. That's a common one. A common one. Well, cool. Those are the questions I have. And the last one is, what are you working on now? And where can people learn more and get involved?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, in essence, me and my team are realtors for domain names. If you want to buy a name or sell names, you can come to our website, saw.com, or you can email us at buzz, B-U-Z-Z, at saw.com as well. Love to hear from you. And if you mention this podcast, that would mean the world to me. Happy to talk.
Amazing. Well, wherever you guys are listening, the cool URL, saw.com, and all the links that Jeff mentioned will be in the show notes. But thanks so much for coming on, Jeff.
Hey, welcome.